Watch this video till the very end, and I promise your views on Indian businesses is never going to be the same. I was actually listening to a conversation online, and funnily, it said that Indian startups and Indian founders don't innovate, or they do very little to no innovation. Now, I personally believe is that India doesn't lack innovation. What it lacks is something deeper. It lacks the narrative power. And that might be one of the reasons why Indian entrepreneurs today are forced to copy American products. Let me explain. You see, today Indian founders build great products, services, and offerings. There are so many entrepreneurs stemming from India. Yet, one thing that they constantly hear is that they're just trying to copy ideas from the West. They're trying to make cheaper versions. They're trying to make alternative versions of what is already available. Their ideas are not original, stemming from a foreign company or a foreign entity. But here's the real question: where is demand being engineered? And most importantly, how is demand engineered? You see, for a company to engineer demand, they must have the ability to create desire amongst their target market. Let me explain this with the help of an example. Let's say you have a company X and your product in this case is a protein bar. So your target market are people who want to transition to a healthy lifestyle. Now, if you want to engineer demand for your particular product, what you have to do is you should have the ability to create desire amongst the target group, which in this particular case are folks who want to transition to a healthy lifestyle. And if you're able to create that desire, guess what? You actually convince the buyer to purchase your product or service. So let us consider the current landscape where most of the brands are transitioned online. Most of the folks today spend a lot of time on social media. How do you actually create that desire? Now, one of the most popular ways that brands use to create desire is actually storytelling. And I'll ask a follow up question: who are the brands that do fantastic storytelling? It's mostly the American brands. Let us discuss this in detail. But before that, I was actually listening to a quote and I love that quote. It says, innovation doesn't start with invention, it starts with demand. On platforms today like Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube, there is arguably no doubt that we live in a global narrative ecosystem. The brands with the strongest storytelling power, which I already mentioned, are mostly the American brands. They shape desire. They get to dictate what's premium. They get to decide what's cool. They get to decide what is aspirational. And us, the Indian consumers, sit on the very same platforms. So, when a global brand creates desire, Indian entrepreneurs are forced to respond to that demand and not actually create something of their own. Let us understand this with an example. Let's take China, one of the fastest growing economies in the world, again, competing with India, competing with the United States of America. You see, China actually built its own platforms and has actually isolated itself from the world. It built platforms like WeChat, Weibo, Bilibili. They essentially sealed their ecosystem. And what this actually led to is something very, very interesting, right? This actually helped in increasing the confidence internally, right? Because there was no global comparison culture because they were completely cut out from the global landscape. And another thing that actually drastically changed, which is actually very interesting, and one of the reasons why I'm making this video, is that demand was engineered locally. Chinese brands shaped Chinese desires. So when you have eliminated global brands from the scenario, right, you've got a lot of brands doing innovation within the country, and brands within the country are able to charge some kind of a premium because again, global competition doesn't exist, right? So when you make that extra money, what do brands actually do? The money actually stays in the system, right? And that extra revenue becomes free cash flow. Now, that free cash flow is what is going to go ahead and fund the research and development. And research and development is what is going to go ahead and fund better products, right? And this loop compounds, and as and when a country, a company, an entity is going to go through these loops, they're going to create phenomenal products and use peak of innovation that everybody talks about today's day and age. Now, India is actually built very differently and it operates very, very differently, right? Because global brands actually engineer demand. We are not at a stage where we have isolated from the global brands. We still are very keen and active and engaged with these global brands. So these are the ones that actually engineer the demand. And we've got these Indian companies and startups on the other hand who look at that demand and are able to supply it in a cheaper or a cost effective manner, right? Which means lower margins, lower surplus, lower reinvestment. And we're the same folks who actually criticize them for not being innovative. But fundamentally, we need to understand that innovation requires narrative power first. If consumers only value what the global narrative approves, local innovation struggles to scale and sometimes is going to go to a stage where it's going to die. And when an Indian founder tries something new, the market often ignores it until and unless it's getting a validation from the foreign entities that we are attached to. That's the cycle. So, innovation requires capital, right? And capital requires demand. And demand requires narrative control. This isn't about isolation. Please don't get me wrong. It's about narrative ownership. When a country controls its narrative, it controls its demand. And when it controls its demand, it builds its capital. And when it builds capital, innovation follows. Innovation grows where confidence innovation doesn't grow where confidence is outsourced. Let's be very, very honest, right? It only grows where narrative is owned.